This is Lou Augusta. Welcome to A Rumor of Empathy. We take a look at trends and dynamics around empathy in the community to figure out whether these trends and dynamics are the real deal in which empathy lives, or are they merely a rumor? Today's show is entitled Empathy Sells, but empathy's limitations sell even better. Let's get right to it. As a popular trend, empathy peaked in the year 2009 with the publication of the late Franz de Waal's now classic, The Age of Empathy. De Waal goes on to profile, quote, our kinder, gentler ancestors in an article dated October 2009 in the middle column of the then largely still hard copy Wall Street Journal, whereby and in which he casts doubt on the killer instincts of our early humanoid ancestors. Duvall's essay champions the position that this aggressive and oversexed species, human beings, Homo sapiens, we are capable of empathy, compassion, altruism, gratitude, generosity, and related pro social attitudes. Now, fast forward a decade and a half to July 13th, 2026. Empathy still sells and is honored and advocated as a powerful intervention to de escalate aggression and conflict. A rigorous and critical empathy still champions the many successful applications of tough love, red teaming, hard empathy, and limit setting, while acknowledging the limitations and the ways that empathy can break down. Phenomena such as emotional contagion, projection, conformity, messages getting lost in translation, in the trials and error of being empathic. A rigorous and critical empathy is committed to doing the hard work of overcoming these breakdowns and misfirings in order to relate authentically and in integrity to the other individual and the individuals in the community. But if empathy still sells, its limitations sell even better. The latest trends is to denounce empathy as a weakness and a danger to Western civilization. God Saad's book, Suicidal Empathy, 2025, goes further than the initial wave of anti empathy advocates, such as Paul Bloom, 2016, Fritz Breithout, 2017, Glenda Carpio, 2023, and Nawali Sirpal, 2019. With Saad, and by the way, his last name has been also pronounced as Sad, so it's God Sad, but really properly it should be Saad. With Saad, the recommendation is not that one should apply rational compassion rather than empathy, Paul Bloom's position, or deploy enlarged thinking, Carpio's challenging and channeling Hannah Arendt instead of empathy, or that empathy is a kind of slave morality masquerading as kindness, Fritz Breithaut's position. Rather, empathy should be added to the list of pro social characteristics such as altruism, compassion, charity, generosity, gratitude, helping those in need, being kind to animals, turning the other cheek, and so on. Even though, strictly speaking, empathy is not an emotion as such, but a form of communication among all emotions. Throw them all under the bus. Being kind makes you and your community a sucker. And as P.T. Barnum, the founding of Ringling Brothers and Barnum Bay Circus, famously noted, there's a sucker born every minute. The anti empathy advocates Offer a thought experiment. If you are in an overcrowded lifeboat after your ship sank, then taking on further survivors in the already leaky lifeboat may cause the entire lifeboat to sink and everyone will perish. Don't be an empathic sucker. Push the competition under. If you do not do so, then you are at risk, get ready, drum roll, at risk of suicidal empathy. Now, what is overlooked in this thought experiment is that it is a setup, a kind of double bind. Given the rock and the hard place, the devil and the deep blue sea, the damned if you do and damned if you don't, it is the reason the ancient Greeks invented tragedy, the reason they invented tragic theory and tragic theater. You are in a lifeboat, and it's because your ship sank. You do not need expanded empathy, you need rescue. In this thought experiment, it's overlooked that the law of the sea and the law of sinking ships is women and children first. That's the rule in any abandoned ship scenario. In an extreme situation, such as the ship is sinking, this sounds like the captain and the crew are providing empathic leadership, which is what is required of them. And there may be, indeed, these days, women in the crew. So when we say women and children first, we mean those who are not on the crew. That is the empathic moment. Women and children first, not shoot the survivors. The takedown of Saad's suicidal empathy requires an article of its own. One is available, though it is not strictly speaking a book review. Go to www.empathylessons.com and search on suicidal empathy. The blog post will come up. You can do so as well at Lou Augusta, LOUAGOSTA.com, and you'd get a more detailed engagement. The very idea that our civilization, Western Civ, is at risk due to an excess of empathy is so laughably absurd and out there as to give pause that the author may perhaps be delusional. This is the same civilization, the West, that brought us two world wars, the Armenian genocide, Auschwitz, Hiroshima, granted seemed like a good idea at the time, the war on terror, granted may seem to some like a good idea at the time, forever wars in the Middle East, Chernobyl, the internment and annihilation of ethnic and racial groups, too numerous to list here, and this civilization is suffering from an excess of empathy? Give me a break. Granted that the vast majority of people, of human beings, are empathic individuals devoted to family, career, community, and country, Saad and his fellow travelers are sensationalizing empathy's acknowledged limitations and are throwing a tomato at them. Now, one can always make a splash by throwing a rotten tomato. If Saad had said, empathy doesn't work with psychopaths, antisocial personality disorder, bullies, corrupt politicians, empathy doesn't work with the criminally insane, then it would be easy to agree, no disagreement. But with such individuals and groups, one must instead set firm boundaries, define forceful limits, call for backup, speak truth to power, deploy tough love as appropriate. Furthermore, Empathy 101, here we're getting back to basics. Empathy 101 teaches that empathy does not work on an active battlefield where war is unfolding, or if one is starving to death, or hanging upside down in a torture chamber. Never underestimate the power of empathy. Never. But empathy in such extreme situations ends up looking like what the FBI hostage negotiating team uses to open communication with the hostage takers, or looking like Red Team, an excellent book by Mika Zenko entitled Red Team, year 2015. So think like the opponent in a war game. That's Red Team. So, what then, we may ask, is the source of this resistance to empathy? What is the source of this throwing a rotten tomato at empathy, with which one can always make a splash? Taking the debate up a level from any particular author's book, let us consider the causes of resistance to empathy. First, the listener or would be empathic person does not want to make him or herself vulnerable to the upset, emotional disequilibrium, or trauma of the struggling individual who is narrating or sharing his or her struggle. Being empathic opens one, makes one, can make one vulnerable. And please note well that all the things said here about resistance to empathy can also be said about compassion, altruism, kindness, generosity, gratitude, and an entire related set of what are sometimes called pro-social attitudes. If the empathic person risks empathic distress, the compassionate person risks compassion fatigue. All the helping professions are at risk of a kind of burnout, affective depletion, or using up one's emotional resources. Now, that doesn't mean become hard hearted. That doesn't mean give up on empathy. That means that professional care is an essential part of the commitment to service, and that those playing the long game of expanding empathy in the community may usefully have in place practices to renew their emotional resource. That is easier said than done, and it must be both said and done. Meanwhile, resistance to empathy on the part of the listener is resistance to being affectively flooded, overwhelmed, or otherwise put at the effect of excessive stimulation of a negative or sometimes even of a positive kind, which in excess can be painful and a source of suffering. For example, who would want to empathize with a person such as Daniel Paul Schreiber at the height of his psychotic breakdown? No one. However, in order to make a difference in helping Daniel Paul, it would be useful to get a taste of his distress, a sample of his fear and anxiety, a vicarious experience of what he experienced as if in the theater or film. So if one is overwhelmed by emotional contagion, then one is doing it wrong. If one is overwhelmed by empathic distress or compassion fatigue, instead of putting one's toe in the water of the other person's pain and suffering, of taking a sample, a vicarious experience, one is jumping in head first. What is required, what one needs to do, is to take a sample of the other person's distress, not the full blown trauma itself. Not the full blown trauma itself. In empathizing, one needs to turn up one's vicarious experience of the other person and tune down one's merger with them. This takes practice. This takes trial and error, hence empathy training, hence the need for empathy lessons. Nevertheless, this is a real issue. Given the level of empathy training, rare is the person who has enough control over their empathy regulation to tune it up or tune it down based on a continuum of disturbances varying from mild, everyday neurotic to deeply psychotic, deeply distressed. Note, however, that the antidote is expanded empathy. If the critique, if the knock, if the rotten tomato against empathy is its parochial and limited, then The solution is not to throw away empathy, but to expand it, to practice it, develop it, elaborate it so that it becomes second nature. In short, and it bears repeating, if empathy is limited, the antidote, the resolution, is more expanded empathy. Now, that's hard work. And once again, the work needs not only to be called out, but to be practiced and implemented. Now, considering further causes of resistance to empathy. Resistance to empathy also comes from a person who is the would-be recipient of empathy, the would-be recipient of compassion, gratitude, empathy, and so on. The struggling individual is so attached to their pain and suffering that these have become a kind of comfort zone. So letting go of the pain and suffering is itself more pain and suffering than the present pain. Letting go of the pain and suffering itself becomes a source of misery. In short, discomfort has become a kind of uncomfortable comfort zone. Now, Marshall Lenihan, the innovator in dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, famously noted, the way out of hell is through misery. Overcoming bad habits, blind spots, maladaptive behaviors that are the causes of a person's suffering and struggle requires struggle and effort that is itself, in her term, a kind of misery. Who wants to hear that? I don't want to hear that. No one wants to hear that. Better to stay in one's comfort zone of discomfort. Hence, another source of resistance to empathy. This is going to take something. This is going to take some work. Furthermore, overcoming one's limitations and getting the empathy, dignity, respect, and recognition for which one is so hungry and for which arguably one is entitled requires an encounter with the unknown, new possibilities which have not been previously available, both for success and for failure, come forth. And as we know, the unknown is one of the most anxiety inspiring things possible, hence further resistance to empathy. Finally, resistance to empathy comes from institutional inertia, namely the faceless, unempathic bureaucracy that seems to live in every call center, customer service desk, government function, or need for troubleshooting with a new appliance, computer interface, or product return. Now, any business person knows that customer service requires empathy. This is one place where the title of this podcast, Empathy Sells, and Empathy's Limitations Sell Even Better. This is one place where that title is completely and patently false. Lack of empathy sends the customer to the competition. And what is more, the customer will not even tell you about it. You will just be out of business. If God Saad is complaining about the fake empathy at many customer service desks and call centers and sales pitches in general, then we are in agreement. Unfortunately, this is not his complaint. He seems really to be anti-kindness and anti-empathy along the lines of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, even amidst a growing body count. Key term, body count. In addition, one should not overlook that all-purpose tip and technique, fake it till you make it. Working from the outside inward, from behavioral practices, from practicing empathic behavior, even if one's feelings lag behind, this is a proven method of bootstrapping oneself into new skills and positive habits. So what's wrong with, on some given day, I'm not feeling very empathic, and I fake it till I make it? That's a way of bootstrapping myself into a kinder, general, more empathic behavior. Now, regarding This is an allusion to Friedrich Nietzsche, our friend Fritz, regarding what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That notorious bad boy, Friedrich Nietzsche, he called such qualities as altruism, compassion, charity. He called them aspects of slave morality, tips and techniques that those out of power can use to get power. Now, by the way, Nietzsche never mentioned the word empathy. He simply never used the word in any language, Einfühlung. He did use the word sympathy from time to time, but he engaged, and he used it in a negative way, and he engaged with related phenomenon such as altruism, charity, compassion, pity. So, what is wrong with the disempowered trying to expand their power? Since the ruling class are not volunteering to give up power, how else would one get power than by strategizing and struggling? What is wrong with the poor, the disadvantaged, the marginalized, the survivors of domestic violence, refugees from conflict zones and natural disasters? What is wrong with the early Christians whom the Romans literally threw to the lions? And by the way, this is not complete. What is wrong with their trying to get power back? Was the USA, now here, cue up the soundbite and the sitcom theme song from moving up on up to the east side in the show, The Jeffersons. Was the USA not premised on struggling immigrants, African Americans, and the marginalized in all ethnic and racial categories getting, and I quote, a piece of the pie? Now, forgive my bad singing here. I cut to the chase. The criticism of empathy as suicidal empathy is a new form of social Darwinism. What the heck is social Darwinism? The short version of social Darwinism is the wolves are saying the sheep should have more understanding for the wolves. We wolves are very hungry. Have empathy for us and come here and let us bite your neck. Social Darwinism, now also called neo-social Darwinism, new social Darwinism, it is the masters in the manor house saying the slaves in the dirt floor cabins out back should be more sympathetic towards the masters. Let me tell you, the burdens of leadership are hard, and riding shotgun over a chain gang in the hot sun is not easy. This admittedly simplistic account of neo-social Darwinism in the context of survival of the fittest is, if you get extinguished, then you deserved it. Well, not exactly. It means in a high stakes game of random variation and natural selection, key term, variation and natural selection, borrowed from Charles Darwin, the defining algorithm, if you get, it means you drew the short straw. If you were born in poverty, born in a conflict zone, in a land rendered uninhabitable by rising seas, forest fires, or climate change, you did nothing to deserve your pain and suffering. This is the classic dilemma of bad things happening to innocent people, which all world religions and most philosophical systems attempt to address in different ways. Empathy is not going to fix the problem of evil and suffering, but I assert, empathy is called forth by these struggles as and is an important part of the solution. Further background on what we might formally label as neo-social Darwinism. In the Gilded Age of the robber barons of capitalism, say 1894, when John Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company forced small competitors out of existence using monopolistic, anti-competitive, and outright corrupt business practices, Standard Oil justified the action by saying, survival of the fittest. This is neo-social Darwinism. For example, when in 1894, rail workers road workers went on strike in Chicago for better wages, health insurance, an 8-hour working day, and improved working conditions. Does this sound familiar or what? U.S. President Grover Cleveland called out 15,000 U.S. Army federal troops on July 3rd, 1894, to break the strike under the pretext that the railroad workers' strike was preventing delivery of the U.S. mail. Here is another example of abuse of power to undermine democratic processes. On April 20, 1914, the Colorado National Guard and guards of the once again Rockefeller owned Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, CF&I, surrounded and attacked a tent colony of 1,200 striking miners, ultimately killing over 20 men, women, and children by randomly firing machine guns into the camp and then burning down the camp. This massacre caused a national outcry, violent sympathy strikes, the so-called 10 Days War, and congressional hearings that disgraced the Rockefeller family public image. The miners' families, however, were still dead. For background on the Ludlow massacre, see Wikipedia, wikipedia.org, wiki Ludlow, Ludlow, massacre. Not to minimize the abuse of power and rampant corruption in the current executive branch, 2016, Q3, 2016, and Washington, D.C. at large, it is business as usual. Stephen Miller and Russell Voigt, key policy architects and advisors to the current executive administration, seem to be studying the Grover Cleveland New Gilded Age playbook and applying it to aspiring immigrants, diversity, inclusion, education, healthcare, and revisionist history that says slaves were not so badly off. And if you believe that, I got some shares in the Brooklyn Bridge that I want to sell you. Full disclosure, Lou Augusta, mistakenly described and subscribed to the view that no such thing as bad publicity existed. And I declined in 2018 and up until 2023 to mention the anti-empath and anti-empathy authors by name, instead referring to an evolutionary psychologist, a celebrity psycholinguist, a prominent Germanic studies teacher, or a Mandarin professor of comparative literature. Why give free publicity to views that were seemingly committed to inhibiting, contracting, devaluing, rather than expressing, expanding, and implementing the practice of empathy? The gambit did not work. The devaluing of empathy got traction, perhaps driven by publishers whose market research, whether accurate or not, suggested that the sales of empathy books had peaked, and who proposed to keep the pot boiling with works that throw empathy under the bus. The challenge is that it's getting crowded under the bus. As noted, one can always make a splash by throwing a rotten tomato, and the would-be critique of empathy uncharitably takes the weakest version of empathy and refutes it. In contrast, a rigorous and critical empathy engages in a process of improvement by cleaning up, key term, clean up, the empathic breakdowns of emotional contagion, projection, conformity, and communications lost in translation, resulting in the expansion of empathy in the individual and the community. Yet another reason that the practice of empathy sells, but empathy's limitation sell even better, is a consequence of empathy's own success. Empathy works. Empathy makes a profound and lasting difference to those who are treated with empathy. But in the age of TikTok, Does empathy work fast enough? Empathy and its many successes are themselves the occasion for the skepticism, resistance, and embracing the obstacles to empathy. A rigorous and critical empathy can be hard work. Being empathic can leave one vulnerable. Better to take the easy way out. The reader may say, I want instant empathy, like instant coffee. Just add water and stir. Wouldn't it be nice? Nor is anyone saying that such a thing as instant empathy is impossible. Instant empathy may work well enough in a pinch, but like instant coffee, the quality may not be on par with that required by a more demanding or discriminating appreciation in taste, or even a more challenging situation. The pervasive cynicism and resignation of the world that are naturally attracted to attacking the sources of inspiration and strength, not those of enervation and stagnation. A treatise on the dark sides of violence will sadly remain timely and relevant, but no one disputes the accuracy of the description. One does not need a treatise against eating dirt because few people are inclined to eat dirt. And if one is so inclined, high probability one has some kind of a vitamin deficiency and needs more different or better vitamins. This brings us to the poster child for devaluing empathy. Fritz Breithaupt book, The Dark Sides of Empathy, 2011, hereafter referred to as Dark Empathy. Breithaupt asserts on page 8 that, quote, to uncritically embrace empathy without caveats, end quote, is the goal debunked by the end of his book. Now, those who, quote, uncritically embrace empathy are debunked. Just so. Please stop right there. Who proposed uncritically embracing empathy or anything? Uncritically embracing empathy is not proposed here or by any authentic empathy advocate. Attributing uncritical thinking to the masters of empathy, such as C. Daniel Batson, 2009, Simon Baron Cohen, 2014, Franz de Waal, 2009, Jean Decity and William Ikes, 2009, empathy advocate Susan Lanzoni, empathy historian, 2018, Mika Zenko, 2015. This list is not complete. Attributing uncritical thinking to these individuals' works and related is itself a concerning sign of lack of critical thinking. Dark empathy is at best naive and at worst disingenuous in imagining practitioners of empathy are uncritical or lack vigor. Quote unquote, uncritically embracing empathy sets up a straw man and gives a green light to uncritical thinking. The program of dark empathy is systematically and sensationally to attribute examples of empathic distress to the practice of empathy itself, charge empathy with these misfirings, and going forward, invalidate and dismiss the practice of empathy. Instead of engaging with the hard work of self inquiry into one's own blind spots to overcome the obstacles and resistance to empathy, dark empathy takes the easy way out, discards empathy, gives up on it. It's like giving up on nutrition because the cook, bless his or her heart, because the poor cook put too much salt in the soup or burned the roast. Dark empathy properly lists many of empathy's breakdowns, misfirings, and obstacles, as do the practitioners of a rigorous and critical empathy. Phenomena such as emotional contagion, projection, conformity, messages getting lost in translation in attempting to be empathic. A rigorous and critical empathy is committed to doing the hard work of overcoming these breakdowns and misfirings in order to relate authentically and in integrity to the other individual. In contrast, dark empathy's commitment seems to be to sensationalize the failings of empathy, now not demonstrating how empathy works and does not work in literature, politics, psychology, and so on. Or rather, the commitment of dark empathy is that empathy does not work, full stop. If dark empathy would have stopped on page 8, empathy is what makes us human, and elaborated on that position, then it would have made a useful contribution. The author, Brighthaupt, really says it. Empathy is essential to our humanity. However, empathy then breaks down into empathic distress. Key term, empathic distress. The issue is that human beings are frequently inhumane, not just a few bad apples, but as the Holocaust on Hannah Arendt taught us about the banality of evil, and the famous quote from Nazi leader Heinrich Himmler, everyone has the potential for real badness, evil, even if few people act on it. Therefore, dial back the empathy, abstain from empathy. Dark empathy asserts sensible things about empathy up front and then sensationalizes the negative and the resulting empathic distress by saying that empathic human beings perpetrate horrid actions. Accurate enough. That is, accurate enough. Human beings are a difficult species. They are an empathic, caring, generous, grateful, and kind species, as well as an aggressive, territorial, and rapacious one. Wouldn't we want to work on expanding the former, kinder, empathic, caring features and inhibiting the latter, the aggressive, oversexed, undersexed, territorial, and rapacious features? That's a rhetorical question. The answer is yes. That Roman soldiers drove nails through the limbs of the people they were crucifying does not invalidate the art of carpentry. Dark empathy makes it sound like it does, as it seemingly, intentionally applies the same argument to empathy. Dark empathy perpetrates a series of fallacies of numbing grossness by saying the forms of empathy are the motives for horrid actions. This is not accurate. Aren't there hidden variables here? Aggression, uninhibited desire, territoriality, hidden variables to this difficult species, Homo sapiens, human beings. The negative stuff is not caused by love of family, it's caused by aggression, hostility, territoriality, inhibited desire. Dark empathy succeeds in being provocative, even sensationalistic, identifying ways in which empathy can and does break down, misfire, and go astray. Yet, dark empathy is argumentatively uncharitable. Uncharitable in philosopher Donald David's sense. It uses the weakest version of the opponent's or empathy advocate's argument, not the stronger. On background, the analytic philosopher and language philosopher Donald Davidson innovated in defining a principle of charity. The principle of argumentative charity goes beyond honest translation or statement of an argument, as noted, asking the thinker, the opponent, the arguer, to engage with the strongest version of an argument rather than intentionally weakening it through setting up a straw man or a distorted, ambiguous representation of the argument. As noted repeatedly, one can make a splash by throwing a rotten tomato, and that is what dark empathy does. The only concern is that my criticisms will sound like there is no such thing as bad publicity or sound like buying the book is worth it. It is not. I have read it carefully, cover to cover, dear reader, so that you do not have to. What a chore! Dark empathy name drops Goethe, Holderlin, Flaubert, Fontaine, author, page 172. One page only before turning to an in-depth engagement with the execution of the domestic U.S. terrorist Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, who was executed for his crime, which says as much about the dark side of the author as about any aspect of empathy. One fundamental fallacy that pervades not just Breithaupt's dark empathy, but the anti-empathy cohort in general. One fundamental fallacy is to confuse empathic distress with empathy itself. That empathy can misfire and fail does not mean one should abstain from empathy. It means to expand one's empathy, one may usefully practice and develop one's empathic capabilities. With practice and effort, one's empathic abilities are broadened and deepened. The celebrated self-psychologist and empathy innovator Heinz Kohut, MD, who is not mentioned in Breithaupt, gives the example of the bad guys, the Nazis, who equipped their dive bombers with sirens, the better to impart empathic distress in the victims, the people they were bombing, thus demonstrating their subtle, that is, the Nazis' subtle empathic appreciation of their victims' feelings. One is tempted to say, the devil may quote scripture. The devil frequently does, and the Nazis and fellow travelers may try to apply some set of a description of empathy. Note that Kohut speaks of fiendish empathy and the use of empathy for a hostile purpose. Remember, carpenters may build you a table, a bed. Carpenters may build a house. The Roman soldiers may practice carpentry and drive nails through the flesh of the people they were crucifying. Not good. Note that Kohut, once again, speaks of fiendish empathy and the use of empathy for a hostile purpose, while emphasizing his value neutral definition of empathy as vicarious introspection. Key term, vicarious introspection, and empathy as a method of data gathering about the other person. Now, if you want the footnote, go to the blog post Suicidal Empathy on www.empathylessons, one word, empathylessons.com. Nevertheless, the point is well taken that empathy is a powerful phenomenon in all its dimensions and requires careful handling. The Nazis apply, this is my opinion, this is not the truth, with a capital T, and consider the possibility. The bad guys, the Nazis apply a kind of entry level emotional contagion or affective transmission of feelings, but the process breaks down at the point of empathic responsiveness. Empathic responsiveness requires a core of acknowledgement and recognition of the other person's humanity, and that you're not getting. Thus, it is arguably plainly evident that the would-be empathy of the Nazis or the white supremacists such as Timothy McVeigh misfires and does so completely and dramatically. The would-be empathy gets itself entangled in a practical contradiction. It is a contradiction to relate humanly to another person, another human being, while dehumanizing the person. That's a contradiction. Empathy doesn't work that way. Empathic responsiveness simply does not admit of bombing people or disqualifying them as less than other human beings when they plainly are human beings. The risk of dark empathy to the reader is that the reader may think its author is an expert in empathy and start quoting the distortions, lack of rigor, critical faux pas, necessary French, faux pas, don't do it, the simple inaccuracies, as if they shed light on empathy. For example, In a case of shocking inaccuracy, dark empathy cites Stockholm syndrome. Say that fast 5 times. Cites Stockholm syndrome as an example of the dark side of empathy. See page 37. No, the mechanism of Stockholm syndrome is not empathy, but, quote, identification with the aggressor. Key defense mechanism, identification with the aggressor. Because the hostages in the Stockholm bank robbery, from which we get Stockholm syndrome, because the hostages identified with the aggressor, the bank robber, and the hostage takers, in order to survive, a 5-day traumatic kidnapping means that people do what they have to do to survive. It is not an example of empathy, but of the book Dark Empathy's lack of psychological acumen and lack of empathy. As noted, identification with the aggressor, because authority figures sometimes often have the means of aggression, identification with the authority figure is crucial in forming the human moral conscience during childhood. And the same mechanism of identification goes off the rails, misfunction, or rather functions in a problematic, even pathological way in the case of a kidnapping, in which, in order to survive, the victim actually builds a relationship with the perpetrator, does not pretend to do so, actually builds the relationship. Breithout's interpretation depends on overlooking the basic definition of empathy, that empathy requires a firm boundary between self and other, calling on that famous pessimistic philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who Nietzsche studied in some detail. Schopenhauer and his notion of compassion and selflessness, really a Buddhist notion which he borrowed in his readings of the South Asian Hindu and sacred text of South Asia. In any case, Schopenhauer's compassion and selflessness and or merger, against which Nietzsche occasionally raged, are breakdowns of empathy. Never was it truer that good fences make good neighbors. A fence, not a wall. And there is a gate in the fence over which the welcoming word empathy is inscribed. A forced choice between more compassion and expanded empathy. In comparison with the long, hard slog through dark empathy, Paul Bloom's Against Empathy, book name Against Empathy, is relatively easy to comprehend and situate. The case against empathy in and according to Bloom is that it is parochial, biased, and limited based on preference for in-group individuals and associations such as family, neighborhood, and the superficial similarities such as ethnic background, race, or local custom. Bloom's recommendation is to pursue rational compassion. Key term, rational compassion. Bloom actually makes it sound like one has to choose between rational compassion and empathy. Given the state of the world, doesn't the world need both more compassion and expanded empathy? The forced choice between the two must be declined. Furthermore, the answer on the part of empathy advocates to the criticism of the, quote, bias and limitation, the parochial aspect of empathy, is direct. The answer is direct. If empathy is sometimes parochial, the solution is not to abstain from empathy, but to expand it. The empathic imperative, if you will, is precisely be inclusive, welcome the outsider, the other. Expanded empathy is what is required to broaden the scope and limits of the community to build harmonious and cooperative relationships that work for everyone. That building such a community is a high bar. That takes nothing away from empathy. Given the complexity of the challenge, one would think that deploying a variety of various methods to make progress, to expand harmony, and agreeableness in the community, compassion, empathy, gratitude. The list is long. Deploy them all. As noted, Bloom's choice between rational compassion and, as the title says, against empathy, this choice seems forced. Given the challenges at hand, don't we need both empathy and compassion of all kinds, rational as well as other kinds, to deal with this difficult species, these human beings? Though I might be mistaken, I am not aware of any advocate of a rigorous and critical empathy who recommends abstaining from compassion. Why should advocates of rational compassion abstain from empathy? Given that against empathy, the title, not the practice, given that against empathy operates with the distinctions rationality and critical thinking, it has much to offer, just not much to offer against empathy. Its discussions of compassion fatigue, self control, delayed gratification, caring and mirroring, the basis of morality, violence and cruelty, thinking about the consequences of one's speech and action, which is always a good idea. Think about what you're saying and what you propose to do. All of these are relevant to the dynamics between empathy and rational compassion. Many of these distinctions, such as self control, delayed gratification, thinking about the consequences of one's speech and action. For example, don't take a couple of shots of whiskey and get behind the wheel of a car. It's not going to go well. You could kill yourself and or someone else or just flat out end up in jail. Anyway, thinking about the consequences of one's behavior and action, these are all features of adult behavior and speaking. Now, it is a concerning fact that many adults are going about their business behaving in immature ways, like adolescents who do not think about the consequences of their behavior and speaking. This says a lot about the breakdown of civility, education, and politics in our world. And once again, the antidote is expanded rationality, compassion, and empathy. This is a good place to note that empathy has a developmental sequence. The empathy of a 2-year old who offers his or her own teddy bear to an upset grown up who is in tears, whose adult suffering the child does not really understand. This generosity, offering the teddy bear, is on a continuum with, but different than, full adult empathy. Nor should the child's empathy be dismissed. Children are exquisitely empathic. They're just not empathic with complicated adult issues. The adults deploy all the aspects of vicarious affect matching with the other person, appreciating who the other person is as a possibility, taking a walk in the other person's shoes while remembering to take off one's own shoes to avoid projection, and responding to the other person in a form of words and gestures that indicates to the other that the listener, the would be empathizing person, gets it, gets what the other person was struggling and is trying to communicate. The key takeaway on adult empathy with children is Christine Olden's 1953 defining statement. And the title of the article is On Adult Empathy with Children. When with a child, the adult is present to his or her own fate as a child of the same age. Note that such a calling forth of the adult's experience does not necessarily align with his or her experience with that of the child in the moment, since the child may be happy and the adult may be unhappy and so on. But the implicit experience called forth is the input to the empathic process of comparing and contrasting one's own experience with that of the child, out of which an empathic response can be produced. What is characteristic of those against empathy, as the title says, is that they engage with the weakest version of the empathically relevant phenomenon at issue, not the strongest. I repeat, they engage with the weakest version of empathy, not the strongest. They engage with the breakdowns and misfirings of empathy, such as emotional contagion, projection, conformity to very ambiguous and not helpful community standards, and communications getting lost in translation. All these are real enough occurrences. And the recommendation is to improve on empathy by analyzing, by taking a look, by asking yourself, what are the facts, what occurred, and take steps to improve the practice of empathy in context. Yet the tactic of the anti-empaths, the anti-empathic cohort, is to roll these misfirings of empathy up into the definition of empathy and then invalidate empathy. In contrast with this argumentative lack of charity, the sound practice of empathy gets it. Empathy can fail, and it is precisely in overcoming these failures, these obstacles and resistances, that a rigorous and critical empathy comes forth and gets implemented. This cipher of enlarged thinking, which remains unintegrated in Kant, became the inspiration for Hannah Arendt's incomplete third volume of The Life of the Mind on political judgment. Once again, it is the folk definition of empathy. The point is that migrant aesthetics, the book, not the distinction, politicizes aesthetics with anti fascist, anti imperialist, anti empirist commitments, rhetoric in the classic sense, and expressions without necessarily making practical recommendations for political action. Now, from an academic point of view, recommendations are not required. And I have many sympathies with the anti fascist. I mean, I align with the anti fascist, anti imperialist, anti empirist commitments, its rhetoric in the classic sense, and expressions. Migrant aesthetics expels empathy from the garden of artistic achievement because empathy does not provide a stable basis for political action, as said in the migrant aesthetics argument. One doesn't necessarily have to agree with it. That's the position we end up with. Never underestimate the relevance of Immanuel Kant or of empathy. Yet, if one wants measurable results from political action, apply Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, 1971, as did Barack Obama in the run up to his being elected president for two times. He was, I believe, an astute student of Alinsky's method of political action. Call forth the complaints and the grievances in the community, take action to address them, and power accrues. In any case, if one wants measurable results from political action, apply Saul Alinsky or the analysis based on Eric Hoffer's The True Believer, published 1951, not Kant's Third Critique. Hoffer calls out the mutilated logic of totalitarian thinking, and Alinsky knew quite well about building community. Building community is another way of saying expanding the inclusiveness of empathy, though Alinsky did not use the word empathy. Empathy lives in community building. In short, the rumor of empathy remains a rumor in the case of migrant aesthetics. It remains a rumor in the case of Breithaupt's dark empathy, in the case of Bloom's against empathy, Gad Saad's suicidal empathy. The rumor is not confirmed. Empathy does not live in these works. It is where empathy goes to become projection, emotional contagion, conformity, messages lost in translation, and fake empathy. It is where empathy goes to become mutilated empathy, like the mutilated fragments of human bones in the desert. Don't go there. In summary, it is not a choice between expanding empathy and ending empire or reducing empire, and an engagement with both is needed. Survivors ask for empathy. When survivors are asked, what do you want? What would make it better? What would soothe the trauma? Rarely do they say punish the perpetrator. Granted, a few do. A few do say punishment would help, but rarely do most survivors say punishment. What they do ask for is acknowledgement, to be heard and believed, to hear the truth about what happened, for apology, accountability, restitution, rehabilitation, prevention of further wrong. On this point, see Judith Herman, Truth and Repair, How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice, 2023. Rarely do survivors make forgiveness a goal if that would require further interaction with the perpetrator, though self-forgiveness should never be dismissed. It bears repeating, though both are needed, survivors do not ask for an end to empire. Survivors ask for empathy. This is Lou Augusta. This has been A Rumor of Empathy.